This video is looking at a brief introduction on how you'd start to think about planning and writing a poetry comparison essay. So generally, looking at comparative essays, lots of the ideas we're going to talk about actually apply to any analytical essay. So you might be required to compare poems, you might be required to compare prose texts, so kind of sections of a novel or non-fiction extracts. But generally these principles hold up for any analytical essay. What I would suggest is that you really concentrate on looking at what you're being asked to do. So if you're just doing this as an exercise that your teachers set you, then look at what guidance they've given you. If you're doing it for an assessment or an examination, look at the assessment objectives and see what you're required to do, where the credit's going to be. Some of them require the integration, so the kind of using of context, as well as the analytical points. So really make sure that you know what's being asked of you before you start. We're down here at this point. The purpose of a comparative essay, you're looking at how the writers have made their choices to create things that can be linked. Okay, so you might be looking at language choices on a word level or a phrase level. You might be looking at technique choices like kind of metaphor or simile. You might be looking at form or structure points. Have both poets used sonnets? Have both poets used a recognised form? Maybe one is a sonnet, one is a ballad. Have both poets used dramatic monologues? If so, how have they created character through those voices? You're basically aiming to find this idea of common ground. Now, that doesn't mean that everything has to be the same. Okay, it's meaning that you're looking for things which are linked in some way to compare and contrast. And for the vast majority of essays of this style, you want your comparison to be integrated within paragraphs or points. You don't want to do an essay which basically, if you look at it, is dealing with poem A and then is dealing with poem B, and you're leaving your reader to implicitly compare because you talk about this point, and this point, and then down here you pick up the same points and think, okay, reader, do the work. You're going to kind of hold that idea in your mind when you get to that paragraph. In fact, if you were going to draw a comparative essay, you kind of want, if I take red as poem A and maybe blue as poem B, you maybe want an essay which after your introduction kind of goes like this in terms of the colour. Maybe put a whole line of blue in there. Okay, so actually you've got both sets of ideas running through your essay. It generally makes it easier to engage with both poems and get higher level ideas if that's the kind of approach you're taking. So if we go to planning, how are you going to start to plan this? Well, I'd decide which poem you're going to lead on. Now, it might be that you're dealing with a task which has given you a specific poem. So, for example, if you're dealing with AQA or some of the other GCSE specs, they might give you your named poem and say, choose one other one from the anthology to match on the subject of, or to write about on the subject of power or strong feelings, or depending on what your anthology is about. So choose the poem you're going to lead on. It might just be the one that you like the most if you're doing it for a class essay or a practice essay. And then take that lead poem and look at the strongest points you can make about the poem, bearing in mind that you can talk about literary methods and techniques, and there's some examples of those there. For a poem, this is really, really important. You should be able to choose specifically poetic techniques. You're writing about poems which are poems. They're not stories, they're not diaries, they're not journals, they're not plays. These terms, these ideas, you find in poems. Poets have put there for a particular reason. So the best poetry essays are always going to cover some of these points as well as your metaphor, repetition, pathetic fallacy, narrative voice, etc. Because it's showing you understand that these poems could only be poems. They've been written along that line. You can also choose, as well as just thinking, okay, we've got two examples of pathetic fallacy here, or we've got, both poets using personal pronouns or a particular type of narrative voice. You can also choose effects and ideas. Okay, so both poets create tension, both poets create a tone of with this. Little aside here, if you're doing AQA and you're looking at the unseen poetry, be careful that comparison question, I think it's 27.2, you can only compare on methods for that one, right? Just if you're doing AQA, unseen poetry, the 8-mark question, part 2, you can only compare on methods, don't compare on ideas. If that has not yet featured in your life or will not feature in your life, ignore that comment. Okay, so when you've got things that you know you're going to be able to talk about from your first poem, the one that you've chosen as a lead poem, get your copy of your other poem out or in front of you, and then think about what points you can complement. Okay, so it may be that you've got poem 1, poem 2, or poem A and poem B, and you've got some great points here about metaphor. Go looking for metaphor in this poem, because then you're trying to generate a series of topic sentences that connect the ideas in your poems. So you're trying to get things like, the writers convey, or both poets, there should be a bullet point there, pretend there's a bullet point there. Both poets use metaphor to create a sense of. And it might be that you've noticed metaphor and the natural world taking over, or metaphor and happiness, or metaphor and cosmic imagery, or metaphor and animal imagery, or something like that. But you've got that link, and from there you can kind of start to develop your ideas. I've given you some sentence starters here. The writers convey a positive tone in different ways. Then you go, poet A does, poet B does. Both X and Y create an increasing sense of threat through. The poets both use rhyme to emphasise the idea of. The use of pathetic fallacy in both poems shows that. Whereas poet A uses assonance to create a sense of blur, poet B uses this, assonance, to convey the blur. Okay, so you've got that strong sentence at the start of your point that says, okay, I've connected both of these poems on this idea. I'm then going to unpick it. And insofar as you can use any sort of formula for this poem, and I'm not a great kind of believer in writing to a strict framework, because I think it kind of gets in your way the better you get at it. But you're trying to convey this idea of both poems do X, whatever X may be. So poem 1 uses that to show how, something, creating a sense of something. Then you think in a similar way, or even in a different way, poem uses X to show blur, creating a sense of blur. Okay? And it's this kind of format that is going to provide the backbone of your essay, that you're doing this over and over again. And the more you practice, the more you practice, she wonders out loud, the more you practice, I think it's a verb, isn't it? The more you will have to say about the detail. Okay, so you're getting that plan together. Where are you going to go with those paragraphs? You've got your quotations. You're going to do everything you'd normally do in terms of embedding your quotations. And in your introduction, you're going to kind of use that as a trailer for your main points. So once you know what you're going to write about, you end up with something like both poets or both, let's say Armitage and Duffy in their poems Mother Any Distance and Before You Were Mine, or both poets Browning and Mew in their poems Porphyria's Lover and The Farmer's Bride, create a sense of such thing through their use of, and then maybe list the techniques, conveying a overriding sense of, or overriding impression that. Something, especially if you're doing it in an exam, that's kind of brief and introductory. And by the time you conclude, again, it's a sort of wrap-up line for an exam-style essay that says, in this way, both poets not only use this, this and this to show, but also this, this and this to create a sense of, right? Thinking about it then, what this kind of thing looks like, you might end up with a, let me see if I can write this in text, you might end up with a, that needs to go away and I need to be able to type into that box, so it says both Browning and, I'm going to move that over here, make it huge, both Browning and Mew, to use Porphyria's Lover and the Farmer's Bride, use caesura, and I'm using the plural of caesura, which autocorrect does not want me to use. I'm going to override autocorrect to go for the Latin plural, in their poems. I need an apostrophe there. Opening stanzas. Okay, there's my topic sentence. If you don't know Porphyria's Lover and Farmer's Bride, go and look them up online. Then we can have Browning's, I want an apostrophe in there. Browning's speaker pauses after the introduction of Porphyria. I'm just going to put P rather than spelling Porphyria. You'd write it out in full to potentially highlight her importance to him and his focus on her. Whereas, so there's our link, Muse, farmer, or farmer's use, let's say, and we're going to connect on caesura, farmer's use of caesura, have to spell it right, caesura, and let's make it a plural because he's going to do it more than once, becomes more fragmented as his narrative develops and his confidence is, let's say confidence and self-control. Self-control is eroded. Okay, so here, let me see, hopefully that will now fit. Yeah, and we can probably make it a little bit bigger. No, we cannot. You can see that we've got our topic sentence here. We know that we're going to be talking about caesura in the opening stanzas. Then we've got, let's look at Porphyria's Lover and say, here's the example that we've found. Here's the effect of it. There's the analysis. There's our link word. There's the point in common again. Here's the effect again. Okay, so you've got that kind of balance. Hopefully that serves as a useful example. And if you haven't read the two poems, go and read them. Okay, good luck with your comparative essay.